When Marco Rubio said our rights come from God, not from government, he thought he was making a patriotic statement. But Tim Kaine wasn't having it. In one of the sharpest Senate takedowns we've seen in a long time, Kaine flipped that line on its head, exposing how that idea isn't patriotic at all, it's dangerous. He drew a straight line from Rubio's words to the logic of theocracies like Iran, where leaders claim divine authority while crushing human rights. What Kaine delivered wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a constitutional masterclass on why America's freedom depends on law, not religion.
Mr. Barnes, I was struck by your opening comments, and I asked to get a copy of them so I could read them and make sure I quoted them correctly. You state, and this is a quote from Secretary Rubio, "Our rights come from God, our Creator, not from our laws, not from our governments." I find that very, very troubling. I'm a devout person. I was a missionary in Honduras. We've got other devout folks in this room, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, American. The notion that rights don't come from laws and don't come from the government, but come from the Creator, that's what the Iranian government believes. It's a theocratic regime that bases its rule on Shia law and targets Sunnis, Baha'is, Jews, Christians, and other religious minorities. And they do it because they believe that they understand what natural rights are from their Creator. So the statement that our rights do not come from our laws or our governments is extremely troubling. I think the motto over the Supreme Court is equal justice under law. The oath that you and I take, pledge to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, not arbitrarily defined natural rights. I'm a strong believer in natural rights, but I have a feeling if we were to have a debate about natural rights in the room and put people around the table with different religious traditions, there would be some significant differences in the definitions of those natural rights. You go on to say, I believe our country and our government is the best in the world and our strength comes from our enduring values. I believe that. But then you say, and you got to choose what to say in your opening testimony, these values aren't an endless list of, quote, rights. You put the quote around that to kind of demean the notion of rights that people create and change and form to meet their own needs or desires. These values aren't identity politics. They're the historic natural rights that we have as individuals pursuing life, liberty, and happiness in the world. Pursuing life, liberty, and happiness. The State Department's Human Rights Report has just struck out all references to the rights of LGBTQ people in countries and the way countries treat LGBTQ people. I mean, do they have a right to liberty? Do they have a right to life? Do they have a right to happiness? Senator Murphy pointed out that the Human Rights Report has taken out information about freedom of association, about freedom of expression, about exploitation of children, about prison conditions. These were all part of the human rights reports that have been done for years by the State Department. I think these are things that are connected to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They've now all been removed from the State Department's annual human rights report. And the notion that, well, we wanted to make it shorter or more readable just doesn't pass the laugh test with me and many others on this committee. I'm not really going to ask you about your testimony because I believe you offered that in a very sincere way, and I don't want to try to change your opinion on something you sincerely believe. But the notion that our rights do not come from our laws or our government should make people very, very nervous. Because people of any religious tradition or none are entitled to the equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment. It shouldn't matter what their religious background is, what they think about God or the Creator, what their church affiliation is. You are entitled in this country, every person, to the equal protection of the laws. And so to demean laws and demean governments and suggest that rights don't come from laws and governments, I mean, again, I think there are such things as natural rights, and I try to live in accord with them. But I would never demean the law. We are a nation of laws, not men. Laws, not people. And if we now, after nearly 250 years, suddenly start to demean that or diminish that and suggest, no, it's natural rights as defined by a leader, the leader of Iran or the leader of any nation, that does not create a place of safety or comfort for folks. Mr. Wilcox, I want to just now move to you quickly. Very important position. I think it might be the largest group of employees within the State Department in Virginia. We care deeply about it. All the Marine security guards who guard our embassies train at Quantico. The Foreign Affairs Security Training Center is at Fort Barfoot in Southern Virginia that trains our State Department personnel to keep themselves and their families safe. I'm a little bit worried about the effect of the massive rifts in the State Department on the security mission. Can you tell me how you would try to make sure that your division has the resources it needs to get the job done?
I do apologize. Senator, could you repeat that question, please?
I'm worried about the rifts, the reductions in force, and the effect of those rifts on the security mission of the Department of State. Tell me how you would work to make sure that we have the resources we need to make sure security is job one.
Yes, sir. I appreciate the question. As you all know, the diplomatic security was not as impacted as the other bureaus. We are the largest bureau, next to consular affairs, perhaps, certainly by budget and number of personnel. It's my understanding that only 2 special agents were RIF'd, and they were not in positions within DS at the time. We did have other security engineers and a few other labor categories that were involuntarily RIF'd. Once confirmed, I'm going to do a full assessment, as I said in my opening statement, of the resources, the personnel, and the infrastructure that I have to accomplish our 3 primary lines of effort, that being embassy operations, dignitary protection, and law enforcement investigations. There is an impact anytime you conduct a RIF, and we lost 1,300 people on the 13th of July. There's no doubt that that impacts morale, and morale is probably more important than any other component in a paramilitary organization, and there should be no mistake that diplomatic security is a paramilitary organization with an embedded law enforcement agency. So the morale will be first and foremost in my thoughts, and I think that my style of leadership, my candor, my clearly articulating the expectations and the standards that we set for our personnel will help that. There's a lot of other things we can do in terms of the allocation of personnel and make sure they're right-sized against the mission sets. But it will be a key focus of mine, and I will focus keenly on what that impact has been, and I will be candid to the chain of command of what I understand that impact to be.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Tim Kaine didn't just challenge Marco Rubio in that hearing, he exposed one of the most dangerous misconceptions that's been quietly creeping into American politics. When Rubio said our rights come from God, not from government, Kaine didn't just disagree, he tore that idea down, brick by brick, showing why it threatens the very foundation of democracy itself. At first glance, Rubio's line sounds inspiring. It sounds moral. But Kaine made us look deeper, because if rights come from God, the next question becomes, who's God? Whose interpretation? Who gets to decide what those divine rights are? Once you start giving any group or leader that authority, you're no longer living in a democracy. You're living under a theocracy, a system where belief replaces law, and faith becomes a weapon of control. Kaine spoke not as a cynic, but as someone who knows faith personally. He's a devout man, a former missionary in Honduras. But he understands what the founders understood. Faith is powerful, but it must never rule the state. When you let religion dictate rights, you instantly divide humanity into the approved and the unapproved. That's not freedom. That's hierarchy disguised as holiness. That's why Kaine drew the comparison to Iran, not to provoke, but to warn. Because in Iran, leaders claim their authority from God too. They say rights come from the Creator. And look at what that's produced. Persecution of women, suppression of minorities, punishment for dissent, and the erasure of anyone who doesn't fit the ruling theology. Kaine's point is crystal clear. The second we start believing rights come from divine interpretation instead of democratic law, we start walking down that same road. The United States was built to reject that idea. Jefferson, Madison, and the framers of the Constitution didn't want divine monarchy. They wanted self-government. They believed in natural rights, yes, but they knew that without law, those rights mean nothing. They don't exist in practice until they're written, codified, and protected by the collective will of the people. The Declaration of Independence may mention a creator, but the Constitution, the document that actually governs, doesn't. That silence is intentional. The founders didn't want anyone's faith to hold a monopoly on human dignity. That's why the phrase carved above the Supreme Court doesn't say justice under God. It says equal justice under law. That's not just legal poetry. It's the moral heartbeat of a secular democracy. Law is what stands between freedom and tyranny, between inclusion and oppression. The moment we start demeaning the idea that rights come from government, as Rubio did, we begin eroding that shield that protects every single one of us, believer or not. And Kaine didn't stop at theory. He pointed to the real-world consequences. The State Department's decision at that time to strip references to LGBTQ rights, child exploitation, and freedom of expression from its human rights reports. He connected that erasure directly to the mindset Rubio was promoting. The idea that real rights are fixed, unchanging, handed down by divine authority. That's the logic that makes some people's rights negotiable, while others are untouchable. Kaine's message was as much a warning as it was a lesson. Once you start letting religion define rights, you let politicians define religion. And history shows us where that leads, to censorship, exclusion, and fear. The brilliance of Kaine's argument is that it reframes patriotism itself. Defending the rule of law isn't anti-faith. It's what allows faith to flourish freely. The law is the great equalizer. It's what says your belief, your identity, your background, none of that can make you more or less human under the Constitution. So when Kaine said, "We are a nation of laws, not men," he was reminding us that laws, not beliefs, are what keep power in check. And when politicians start using God as a political argument, that's not spirituality, that's control wrapped in reverence. This moment matters because it's about more than a Senate exchange. It's about who we are as a people. Are we a nation defined by law, equality, and the collective will of citizens, or by whoever claims divine authority loudest? Kaine's answer was firm. Freedom belongs to everyone, not just those who share one faith, one book, or one doctrine. So if this moment resonated with you, if you believe in a democracy that protects all of us equally, that values law over dogma and inclusion over exclusion, don't just scroll past it. This is what we're about here on Left Lens, cutting through the slogans, breaking down the power plays, and exposing the real stakes behind these political moments. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to Left Lens, and turn on notifications, because we're not here to just replay hearings. We're here to help you understand them, to see what they reveal about where this country is headed and what it's going to take to keep it just, equal, and truly free. You said,